So amusingly enough, for a cyberspace professional, I'm actually not really good when it comes to a lot of the cyber type things. So didn't realize that this feature would cut my video at a random point during the middle of it, so apologize for the gap. But going on off of where I came from, or where I was at, basically that you can't always necessarily, or we rely on the trust factor of a lot of things for social engineering to work, or the attacker does, I should say. So how do we defend against that? Well, first, there's vigilant patching, so making sure that your systems are always up to date, so attackers can't use old vulnerabilities to take advantage of you and your system. Two, user education, to make sure that the individuals that are functioning on the system do so in a way that maintains cyber hygiene practices. So they're not clicking on strange links, they're not going to strange sites, they're not opening attachments from people they don't trust, etc., like the bare bones type of user education to make sure that they don't make the very obvious mistakes. And then the third thing, and this is more in lines with what I have to do, is watching for cyber intelligence. So cyber intelligence is just like cyberspace in the sense that it's hard to define. Just like in cyberspace, you don't really know what does or doesn't consist of it, or depending on who you ask, that answer is going to change. The same exact thing with cyber intelligence. Because yes, you would like to assume that in some senses it would make sense that, okay, all things that are pertaining to information that informs the cyberspace operations counts as intelligence, cool. But what does that actually mean in the real world? That's where it starts to get a little bit more wishy-washy, and it's hard for accurate definitions that can really serve as a useful tool and foundation to build upon. So cyber intelligence has been just an open air question for at least my entire career, and stretching back before that, from my understanding as well. And will probably continue to be somewhat of an undefined and nebulous area so long as cyberspace itself is an undefined and nebulous area. It's hard to understand exactly what would be defined as intelligence to support something if you don't know what that thing is to begin with. So there's a lot of flaws when it comes to intelligence and the intelligence community, as I'm familiar with it. Again, in my opinion, not in the opinion of any official government source. So some of those issues that I've seen is too much data, too few analysts. So you can have all the data in the world, but if you can't make sense of it, then really it's useless. There's nothing that you're going to be able to gain out of it. Biases in reporting. So depending on who is analyzing that data, the biases that they bring into the process, that's going to cause issues. So if somebody shows up and they have very little experience with cyber or computers or networks or anything like that, they're going to get vastly different analysis of any given cyber intel than somebody who that's their entire background, their entire career has been tied to and associated with cyber. Unclear prioritization of efforts. That's another thing that often happens is priorities will shift dramatically, and that doesn't work. It's not very conducive to long-term and useful intelligence work, because if you've got a team working on project A and they're setting forward on it, they've put resources into it, everybody's focused on it, and then right before they start getting results, something new pops up and they all get shunted over to project B, except for a few that have some areas of expertise. So they're now on project C, and project A has a skeleton crew left with it. Now you've got 3 different projects with different levels of priorities that none of them are actually advancing anywhere because none of them have the resources to do so. So sticking with a priority and moving forward with it for a long enough time to get relevant, useful intelligence out of it, that's very important. But because cyber shifts so much, it's hard to make sure that you're able to have that dedicated level of effort put towards any one project. And then finite resources are always going to be a complication. There are only so many trained analysts out there. And like I said before, there's more data than we know what to do with. So there's a shortfall there of resources of how we're able to actually get that intelligence translated into something useful and pass it along to the areas where people can make use of it. So there are a few other differences between cyber intelligence and regular intelligence. One being that cyber shifts every day. the cyber landscape is not the equivalent of any other landscape. So, for example, it's relatively easy to understand gathering intelligence from an Iranian nuclear reactor. The reactor is always in the same place. You are fairly confident that you understand what the mission is of that reactor, and there are a myriad of different ways that one can gather intelligence from it. There's signals intelligence of the stuff that's coming, via radio out of there. There's visual intelligence of like ISR intelligence with satellites and overflights and people on the ground taking pictures of it. There's human intelligence of trying to get agents inside the facility itself. All sorts of different aspects that you can really tie into this, trying to understand what the reactor is doing and what the outcome of those projects is. Cyber is pretty different. The network is never the same minute to minute. So while you can be confident that that reactor is going to be there tomorrow, you can't be confident that that computer that you're trying to get information from or that has been attacking you is going to be there the next minute. It could just disappear and you never see it again. And it's as easy as unplugging the Ethernet cord or turning off the Wi-Fi. Now that computer, for all intents and purposes, is invisible to you, and you'll never be able to find it unless somehow you're magically able to track it down. And even if you're able to track it down, if they wipe the hard drive, or more likely they slammed a nail through it, there's nothing that you're going to be able to get from it. So that source is just gone forever. Another aspect is you have no idea where that important information lies. Again, with the reactor, cool, you know where the reactor is, and you know that the information that you need is coming from the reactor. There's no way to necessarily hide that. Whereas with cyber, like I mentioned before, when attacks can go from point to point to point to point to point to hide where the origin of it is, it's the same with basically everything in cyber. Everything can be shifted, moved. What's important today may be obsolete and unimportant tomorrow. And then something new might be put on the system today, and then that's transferred to a different network. Everything is constantly moving and shifting. So there is no solid understood target of where this is where I need to be, generally speaking. There are always exceptions, of course, but generally you can't be sure of anything. And then finally, everything can be obfuscated, so hidden. In the same sense of that needle in a haystack example that I used before, everything can be put in a new haystack somewhere else, and you're having to start over from scratch of finding that needle again. And if the target or the adversary chooses to change things around, you could be in the middle of the haystack and then find yourself in a completely new haystack with zero idea of how you got there or where everything got shifted. All you know is that you're looking at everything from a brand new perspective and have no idea where to start. So cyberspace causes a lot of interesting issues when it comes to cyber intelligence, just because of all those different things that change and shift like no other domain that intelligence really has to deal with. So it makes things very complicated. It makes things interesting a lot of times too, because it is always the Wild West in a sense of you never know what you're going to find. But when you're coming at it from the defensive perspective like I am, it can be very frustrating because you know that there are people out there that are trying to get into your system. You know that they have certain tactics, techniques, and procedures that they're going to use to do that. And that's really all you know. You can know your own system to a certain extent, but even then, because it shifts so often, you don't necessarily have complete awareness of where everything is on your own network at any given time, which causes its own problems. So it's a constant battle of trying to understand your own network, trying to understand what people want to target in your network, and trying to understand how they can go about targeting it. And intelligence is the foundation that feeds into all of those things. That the better your intelligence is, the better understanding you are going to have of what those threats are to your network and how you can best mitigate those threats. So just to wrap everything up here, cyber is everywhere and it impacts every part of your life. I'm sure that every person in this room has a computer, has a phone, has other forms of cloud-enabled and connected devices that you use to do everything from taking notes in this class that you're in right now to paying your bills, to doing online banking, to planning your next trip, to XYZ. Everything that we do really at this point is kind of underpinned by cyber and the connections that are made through cyberspace. So with that, I want to offer just 3 little bits of advice to make sure that you are able to secure yourself as much as you can against some of the threats that are out there. So first and foremost, please keep your systems patched. Keep them as up to date as you can. Anytime that Windows says it needs to do an update, don't just keep hitting snooze, let it update. Those updates are there for a reason, because if Windows knows that there is a vulnerability and has patched it, that means that that is in the public sphere for consumption, that everybody else knows that that thing that they're patching is a vulnerability that they can take advantage of. So as soon as those things are well known, people make automated attacks to attack those specific vulnerabilities. So you become low-hanging fruit if you don't keep your system patched and up to date. Number 2, never click on a link unless you're absolutely sure that you know where it goes and that you trust the source of who gave you that link in the first place. I'm sure we've all seen like the random Facebook messages that show up and it's just this super long hyperlink with something that says like, hey, I saw this really cool thing from somebody you haven't talked to in 20 years. And then when people click it, what do you know? Like their Facebook account gets locked out. Somebody else has ownership of it now, and that begins to propagate the same message to other people on your friends list. It's very easy to click the wrong link and end up inviting that attacker, that adversary, into your system so that they now control it. So always double check on the links that you're clicking and the attachments that come in emails and things like that to make sure that there's nothing malicious about them. And the final little bit is back up your data. Back it up at least weekly. If you can, there are plenty of ways that you can automate backups that make it very simple. I would recommend doing it on a daily basis, because that way, if there ever is a reason why you were attacked and you lose control of your system, you lose the ability to get in, like whatever the case may be, if you have a backup, cool. You can start over from where you were a day ago, a week ago, whatever the case may be. And yeah, you lost a little bit of that time, but everything else is secure, so you can safely ignore whatever else is happening if they're doing like a ransomware attack or something like that on you. You don't have to pay. You don't have to worry about working your way through all this. You just say, okay, tough, and you revert back to a previous image and patch yourself to make sure you're up to date so it doesn't happen again, and then you're good to go. So keep your systems patched. Never click the link, and make sure you back up your data. So those are the best 3 bits of advice that I can provide just for the average user to make sure that they're safe and protected in cyberspace. So thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody today. If you do have further questions about cyberspace or anything to do with the Air Force, the Space Force, or what have you, please feel free to reach out to me. You can email me at jolleman42@gmail.com, and I would be happy to answer whatever questions you got. Again, thank you for your time, and I hope I was able to at least provide a little bit of illumination today for you. Thanks. Bye.